I want you to picture something. It's 1931, and you're a young kid in the Great Depression. You and your friends, the distinguished company you've asked to come with you to the Picture Palace, walk into a dimly lit theater. You've managed to scrape together enough spare change in Depression-era America to buy a 35-cent movie ticket, and by God, that's what you'll spend your money on, even if it means you'll starve. Because there's a new kind of thrill that these picture palaces, or movie theaters, have to offer to break up the gray monotony of life in the Great Depression. A new picture is playing, one deemed so disturbing, so horrifying that no one in their right mind would watch it. But you, of course, are not in your right mind. You're the kid in the Great Depression, remember? Boredom can be deadly to someone of your age. So why not take up the chance to see this new film? Why not take up the chance to see the birth of the modern horror blockbuster? Why not take up the chance to see Frankenstein? Here's another story. It's the late 2010s. You're an avid horror fan. You've seen all your classics, all your B-movies, all your Hitchcocks, and all your slashers. You think you've seen it all. But trust me, you haven't. This period of horror movies is filled with the unorthodox, the emotionally disturbing, and the innovative. Films like The Lighthouse and Hereditary dominate the horror scene today, continuing to offer our even hardcore fans of the genre something they've never seen before. Clearly, horror movies are something that's entertained and terrified audiences for over a century now. If history is any indicator, it's a genre that isn't going away anytime soon. But what makes this genre avoid a decline in popularity that other genres like westerns and detective noir films fall victim to? Given all the examples I mentioned earlier, you could assume that horror movies have existed for so long because they're just too fun to let die. Where else would we get our scares if the horror movie genre went where westerns and noirs did? But I think the reason why horror movies are more popular now than 100 years later is a little deeper than that. I think that because horror, good horror, reflects its audience and their fears in the most horrifying ways, in addition to already being a thrilling and scary experience. A good example of what I mean is Jordan Peele's 2017 film, Get Out. The film acts as both an entertaining horror movie that provides plenty of scares and a deep-rooted social commentary that reflects the ugliest parts of our society. But is this style of layered filmmaking something that's always existed within the genre? Or is it a product of the new generation, a clever attempt at staving off the slow, quiet death that most film genres undergo once they've overstayed their welcome? I'm going to be looking at some of the best examples of horror throughout the decades to find out how horror movies have evolved over time and what techniques they use to stay at the forefront of moviegoers' attention for nearly a century. The motion picture camera was invented around the turn of the 20th century as a sort of novelty magic trick, comparable to something like a funhouse mirror or even a house of mirrors, something meant to entertain guests for a few seconds, and that's it. But eventually, filmmakers like Georges Méliès and the Lumière brothers began focusing on telling coherent stories with their moving pictures. Georges Méliès is considered to be the first horror filmmaker, crafting films such as The House of the Devil, The Bewitched Inn, and The Alchemist's Hallucination, with the intent to entertain and scare audiences. This gives us our first real clear definition of what the horror genre was at the time, trick filmmaking used to scare, thrill, and otherwise entertain an audience who had never seen anything like it before. Outside the realm of film, this time period was one of great global change. World War I had decimated much of Europe, and many nations, including Germany, were in terrible shape. In Germany at the time, a new art style unique to the country was being born, partially as a result of the terrible conditions in post-war Europe. German Expressionism, a form of art in which German people of the 1920s expressed inner thoughts and feelings rather than physical or spiritual depictions, was rapidly emerging as the dominant art form in the country. This translated to film with classic horror movies such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. Here is where we see horror movies as more than just simple entertainment. These films are the first examples of horror being something more introspective, something reflective of horror that lurks below humanity's very surface. And almost simultaneously, a very different phenomenon was occurring within the United States. The movie industry was growing with the birth of Hollywood and other film production centers around the US. Popular movie stars emerged as well as popular film directors. The US film industry was still very focused on entertainment over art at this time. Some notable examples of this period are The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Phantom of the Opera, both starring famous horror actor Lon Chaney. These films were some of the most popular horror films America had to offer at the time. Almost all of them were simply more advanced versions of the magic tricks developed by the first filmmakers of the past generation. In the 1930s, horror movies continued steamrolling their way into the mainstream. Big-name studios like Universal Studios produced films like Dracula, Frankenstein, and Freaks. The first two, and the third to a lesser extent, became cultural phenomena that shocked and entertained audiences well over 100 years into the future. These films were, at the time, received by audience as utterly horrifying and deeply unsettling, giving the genre its reputation. These movies were part of a golden age of Hollywood horror films. Throughout the 1940s, American movie studios would produce films that were designed to thrill audiences, films that would be shocking and horrifying to the unsuspecting viewer. This is perhaps the only time in film history where simply thrilling the audience was enough for the most cynical of critics. In Germany, horror films were still very different from those produced in America. Films like M and Vampire were still German expressionist in nature, but didn't necessarily make it into the global mainstream that American films did. These films slowed down tremendously in the mid-1930s due to Nazi rule in Germany, forcing many filmmakers to flee the country. As a result, the German expressionist movement had largely died out, with traces living on in Hollywood-produced films directed by filmmakers who have fled Germany. By the 1940s, Universal's immensely successful formula for making horror movies was beginning to grow stale. With audiences' reactions to films of this period growing more and more tired, filmmakers knew that something had to change, and fast. They may have been critical in financial successes in the past, but films emulating Dracula and Frankenstein could not survive in this environment. Sequels like Son of Dracula and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman wouldn't cut it either, which is ironic because modern Hollywood is almost entirely sequels and ensemble films. Filmmakers tried some new techniques such as combining horror with comedy, eventually gaining some success. Abbott and Costello films were typically a success, and it's apparent they still are today, because they're constantly on TV. Nothing too notable really came out of these movies, except for infusing comedy in an otherwise intrinsically serious genre. Other filmmakers stuck with a more serious tone, adding drama to horror movies, or rather, horror to drama movies, to use fear tactics as a device to tell an otherwise grounded and realistic story. Regardless of filmmaking technique, this period of horror filmmaking was characterized by the first inkling of thought that this genre might be temporary, and its short boom of popularity in the 1930s would fall flat in the coming years. Directors needed inspiration if they were going to keep the genre alive into the mid-20th century. The 1950s, a time known for its fashion, rock and roll, and threat of total global annihilation at the push of a button. The 1950s is known for the birth of modern pop culture, with rock music, movies, and comic books exploding into the mainstream, but it was also a time of great fear. Global threats dominated the political sphere, tensions divided America, and new scientific discoveries made us question our place within the universe. To many, this might be a time of great worry, but to the twisted mind, it's an oasis of inspiration for horror. The 1950s introduced films that would terrify audiences by incorporating and playing off of real-world fears, such as nuclear bombs, homeland invasion, and limitless scientific discovery. Films like Godzilla, a very successful Japanese film, literally used nuclear weapons as the source of horror, featuring creatures created by bombs that terrorize and destroy great cities. Other movies, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, played off of the fears of the time a lot less literally. In the film, aliens invaded Earth and took the form of your friends, your neighbors, or your family. This, of course, can be seen as a parallel to the Red Scare of the 1950s, in which people were afraid that the people they trusted the most were secretly communist spies sent from the USSR. This trend was clearly successful in revitalizing an otherwise tired genre. It continued through the 1960s, albeit much more subtle. The 1960s were a time of great turmoil. America was the most divided it had been since the Civil War, torn apart by foreign conflicts and racial divides within the country. These tensions were certainly played upon in horror films, but more common in this period were the edgier and more boundary-pushing tone that the genre had in this time, inspired by the edgy and revolutionary times of the 1960s. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock, Roman Polanski, and George Romero pushed the boundaries of what could be in film regarding violence and other explicit content. In a way similar to the shock horror of early films like Dracula and Frankenstein, these films were successful both because they shocked and horrified the audience, but also because they represented the darker parts of American society at this time. Horror movies of the 1970s were also influenced by the turmoil that the world was going through at the time. Films of this decade were arguably even darker and more serious than those of the 1960s, with films such as The Wicker Man and Dawn of the Dead dealing with topical social issues of the decade. Films also became notably more shocking and violent than ever before, with films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I Spit on Your Grave, and since the 1970s had the birth of modern slasher films, Halloween. Like the very first years of the horror genre, the decades between the 1940s and the 1980s were once again a time of tremendous change for the genre. Films became much more topical, and much more in tune with the fears and concerns of everyday people. Many of these changes are still staples of the genre today, making it clear that techniques like making films more topical and introducing countless new subgenres of horror helped to revitalize a genre on the brink of irrelevance. If the mid-19th century was all about revitalizing horror and breaking the predictability the genre had fallen into, the later century films were about embracing that same predictability. In the same way that horror movies of the 1930s and the 1940s fell into the Universal Studios formula, horror movies of the 1980s and 1990s became predictable with the endless slashers that came out of those decades. The 1980s alone had approximately 250 slasher movies, so it's safe to say there was definitely a pattern present. But this isn't to say that there weren't other horror movies out there. Films like The Thing and The Fly utilized practical effects and grotesque body horror, while movies like Poltergeist and Ghostbusters became classics by being films that the whole family could come see. The 1990s, too, were dominated by slashers, as well as franchises like Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street. One particular movie in this decade, however, stood apart. Wes Craven's 1996 film Scream was notable for being a so-called meta-slasher, poking fun at tropes established by the genre in an effectively scary yet funny film. As the decade came to a close, slasher films weren't as popular as they used to be. But still, big-budget studios were struggling to make as many instant classics that they were able to produce in the past. While these big-name studios were at a loss for instant horror icons in the vein of Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, it grew apparent that the fate of the genre rested in smaller hands. Smaller movies with almost non-existent budgets like Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity became known as found footage movies. Like the slasher, bigger studios would soon catch on to the popularity of these films, and more importantly, the profitability of this new subgenre. As the 1990s and the 2000s went on, the found footage genre went by the way of the slasher and were produced to the point of oversaturation. The 1980s to the early 2000s was a period marked by the unfortunate capitalistic desire to make as much money off of these films as possible rather than prioritizing good art. This resulted in subgenres like slashers and found footage films being exploited for profitability, effectively causing another creative vacuum, not unlike the one that the genre faced in the 1940s. The only thing, I think, that kept the genre from fading here was the fact that it had been around for nearly a century at this point. Fans of the genre were always going to be fans of the horror genre, and this is likely what got the genre through its second big lull. By the start of the 2010s, the horror genre had arguably become the most predictable it ever would be. New slashers would always feel like old slashers, new ghost movies would always feel like old ghost movies, and new zombie movies, well, you get the idea. And that's assuming the newest horror movie was even an original story. This time period was full of remakes and reboots of old franchises in the past. Once again, much like the 1940s, we find ourselves in an extended period of the genre feeling stale. But if history repeats itself, as it so often does, that must mean that following this period of staleness comes a time of great innovation. Well, maybe. But however revitalizing these films were with their notable filmmaking and storytelling, they were still fairly orthodox in terms of presentation. All the basics were there for something truly groundbreaking, but they never really reached their full potential. This is okay since they were really only ever intended to revitalize a genre that had fallen into boring staleness. But if filmmakers ever wanted to reach the level of creativity and storytelling they had in the 1960s and 70s, it was going to take a little more. One of the first good examples of this is the 2014 film It Follows. David Robert Mitchell's haunting film is one that is notably unique in tone and style of storytelling. It forgoes many tropes of the genre, while at the same time embracing others to create scenes that are both memorable and utterly terrifying. With the rise of the now very popular independent film studio A24, horror movies have levels of creative freedom never before seen. Many of today's greatest films are A24 produced horrors, including Robert Eggers' The Witch and The Lighthouse and Ari Aster's Hereditary and Midsommar. This production studio is one that gives nearly complete creative freedom to its filmmakers, and it shows. Absent are the ways of more financially motivated studios like Universal Studios or Paramount, replaced by the drive to create creative and memorable films. Directors are able to utilize the most interesting techniques of filmmaking to bring their vision to life. And these films, while not always blockbusters, are nearly all critical successes. Many other studios have seen how much people like these offbeat indie horrors and have since taken similar steps. Even Universal, once the king of stale horror movies, has now produced some of the greatest films of this generation such as Get Out or Us. It is with this newfound creative freedom that the horror genre has truly been revolutionized once again, which looks like it will lead us into a new generation of filmmakers, horror or otherwise. It's hard to say with absolute certainty what the future of the horror genre will bring. Perhaps this recent renaissance of creative horror movies will never die, creating an endless stream of classics for us to enjoy. But if history has taught us anything, it's that this new wave of horror will probably fall victim to either corporate greed or simple staleness like all of the others. But on the other hand, history has taught us that though things may look bleak sometimes for this twisted genre of film, its fans and filmmakers alike are so in love with the idea of horror storytelling that it may be a genre that will live for as long as the art form of film itself.